The desynchronization event began at 1402 EST within the North American Sky Grid, or NASG, coordinator, a moment that would later be marked in engineering postmortems as the most consequential software fault in the history of civilian airspace management. The root cause was deceptively simple: a legacy leap-second correction embedded in the underlying Unix timestamp architecture, a line of code inherited from a 2019 patch that had never been stress-tested against a fully saturated continental drone network. When the correction fired, it conflicted directly with the drone's real-time kinematic positioning clocks, which were operating on a separate GPS-disciplined time source that had not yet received the same correction. In a fraction of a second, the localized coordinate system for over 85,000 autonomous logistics units shifted by exactly 0.5 meters in the horizontal plane. To a human observer, half a meter is nothing. To the drone's onboard collision avoidance systems, or CAS, running threat assessment algorithms at 200 cycles per second, this shift appeared as a simultaneous encroaching threat from every single neighboring unit in the sky. Every drone in the same instant perceived every other drone as having lurched half a meter closer. The safety first priority flag, hard-coded at the firmware level and intentionally designed to be unoverridable by any external command, fired across the entire network simultaneously. All mission objectives, all delivery routes, all return to base queues were cleared from active memory. Across the continental United States, from the logistics hubs of Memphis to the suburban delivery corridors of Boston, thousands of drones ceased forward flight in unison and entered with the system designated as a hoverlock state. Within 11 seconds of the timestamp correction, the entire operational sky had transformed. Where there had been 85,000 moving points of light and sound, there were now 85,000 stationary ones, suspended in a perfect, terrible stillness at 400 feet, creating a static, buzzing ceiling of carbon fiber and lithium that stretched from coast to coast.
The acoustic signature of the event was unlike anything previously recorded in civilian airspace history, and it became one of the most psychologically disturbing aspects of the disaster for the people on the ground. A single delivery drone produces a high-pitched, multitonal whine, the result of 4 to 8 brushless motors spinning carbon fiber blades at between 4,000 and 6,000 RPM. It is an unremarkable sound in isolation, easy to tune out the way one tunes out traffic or wind. But 85,000 of them, locked in stationary hover simultaneously, produced something categorically different. The combined acoustic output settled into a standing wave at approximately 400 Hz, a frequency that sits at the lower edge of human vocal range and has a well-documented physiological effect on the inner ear and chest cavity. Residents in affected suburbs described the sound not as noise, but as pressure, a vibration that entered through the sternum and resonated in the teeth. Telemetry data from individual flight controllers showed the motors were consuming 85% of their available current just to maintain a precision hover against localized wind gusts, meaning every unit was running near its thermal ceiling from the moment the lock began. The centralized command centers, initially unaware of the scale of the event, attempted to broadcast a standard return to base or RTB signal at 1409 EST, 7 minutes after the lock began. The signal was received by every unit in the network. Every unit processed it, and every unit rejected it. The drone's internal logic, still reading the corrected coordinate data as an active high-density collision environment, interpreted the commanded descent and lateral movement toward base as a navigation path directly through with the CAS classified as an impenetrable wall of proximate objects. The RTB command was logged, evaluated, and discarded in approximately 0.003 seconds per unit. The sky became a digital stalemate, a network of machines that were each individually functioning exactly as designed, producing collectively an outcome that no designer had ever modeled. On the ground, the sound continued to build as thermal updrafts from sun-warmed asphalt pushed against the hovering units, forcing their motors to work harder. People came out of their homes and offices and stood on sidewalks looking up at a sky that looked almost normal but sounded like the end of the world. The vibration was described by one resident in Phoenix as a massive invisible hive that had taken up residence directly above the city, a sound that vibrated through windows and car windshields and made dogs across entire zip codes howl in unison.
By 1445 EST, 43 minutes into the lock, the battery discharge curves across the swarm began crossing the threshold designated in the firmware as critical depletion, defined as the point at which remaining stored energy drops below the calculated minimum required for a controlled emergency landing plus a 10% safety buffer. Under normal operating conditions, this threshold triggers an automatic controlled descent to the nearest safe landing zone, a graceful degradation that the system's designers had spent considerable time perfecting. But the hoverlock state had introduced a condition the emergency landing subroutine had never been written to handle. The landing logic would execute a standard descent only after first confirming that the airspace directly below the unit was clear of collision hazards. The CAS, still reading the phantom 0.5-meter shift as a live threat environment, was returning a continuous unsafe to descend flag for every unit in the network. The drones were caught in a logical vice. They could not remain aloft indefinitely because their batteries were dying, and they could not descend because their safety systems forbade it. They remained pinned to the sky, draining their remaining voltage to fight gravity, burning through their last reserves at a rate that engineers at the monitoring stations were watching in real time with growing horror. The thermal maps of the battery cells, transmitted back to base stations across the country, showed unit after unit climbing into the red. In Los Angeles, the situation developed a secondary complication when a cluster of approximately 340 units in the Torrance corridor attempted an autonomous workaround, reaching out to nearby 5G cellular towers to establish a secondary data link that might provide an updated coordinate correction and break the lock. The attempt overloaded the tower's data uplink capacity and caused a localized power surge in the antenna arrays. 3 units, whose sensor arrays made direct radio frequency contact with the overloaded towers, suffered immediate electrical fires in their onboard electronics, the first physical damage of the event, small orange flickers visible from the ground that residents initially mistook for birds.
The first kinetic release occurred over Chicago at 1512 EST, 70 minutes after the initial desynchronization, and it was witnessed by hundreds of people on the ground who had gathered on the shores of Lake Michigan and on rooftop bars in the River North neighborhood, many of them having spent the better part of an hour simply watching the sky and filming what they assumed would become a historic but ultimately harmless piece of viral footage. The unit that fell first was a heavy-lift logistics variant, a larger class of drone designed to carry industrial and commercial payloads of up to 50 pounds, distinguishable from standard delivery drones by its wider 8-rotor frame and the bright orange safety markings on its landing struts. It had been carrying a 40-pound crate of automotive components bound for a distribution center in Schaumburg when the lock began. For 70 minutes, it had burned through its oversized battery pack maintaining hover, and at 15:12:34, it suffered a total voltage collapse, all 8 motors losing power simultaneously as the battery management system executed a hard cutoff to prevent thermal runaway. As the brushless motors lost torque, the aerodynamic instability of the unpowered frame asserted itself immediately. The unit flipped 180 degrees in approximately 0.8 seconds, its payload swinging on its tether and accelerating the rotation. It entered a terminal tumble, spinning and falling in an irregular corkscrew that covered nearly 300 meters of lateral distance during its 400-foot descent. It struck the roof of a commuter bus traveling westbound on the I-90 at an angle of approximately 60 degrees. The impact force calculated by later forensic engineers at 4,500 newtons, roughly equivalent to being struck by a compact car traveling at 30 miles per hour. The bus driver and 2 passengers in the front rows were killed instantly. The automotive components, now scattered across 2 lanes of the interstate, caused a secondary pileup involving 11 vehicles. This was the first recorded fatality of the Skylock event. It would not be the last. Within 4 minutes of the first kinetic release, the depletion cascades reached a statistical tipping point across the eastern seaboard, where the denser urban deployment had meant higher motor loads and faster battery drain. The characteristic 400 Hz hum that had blanketed the coast for over an hour began to cut out in sections, unit by unit, replaced in each case by a brief silence, and then the sound of whistling air as thousands of 25-kilogram machines, each one roughly the size and weight of a large motorcycle engine, began to fall out of the sky. The statistical analysis compiled by forensic teams in the weeks following the event documented 142 fatalities occurring within the first 60 minutes of the kinetic release phase, a number that became the central figure in every subsequent news report, congressional hearing, and engineering ethics review. The true horror of that number, which investigators were at pains to communicate to a public struggling to process the scale of the disaster, was not its size, but its distribution. These were not 142 people gathered in one place, killed by a single catastrophic failure. They were scattered across 11 states, killed in ones and twos and small groups by a rain of falling machines that came without warning and without pattern. The majority of the fatalities occurred in high-traffic urban corridors, where the density of both drones and people was highest, where falling units struck pedestrians on crowded sidewalks or impacted roadways at highway speeds, and caused the multi-vehicle pileups that accounted for nearly a third of the total death count. Drivers swerving to avoid falling debris caused secondary accidents involving vehicles that were never struck directly. In suburban New Jersey, a medium-class delivery drone carrying a package of household goods struck a residential gas main on Elm Street in Westfield with sufficient force to rupture the line. The ignition source was the drone's own battery, which had not fully discharged at the moment of impact and sparked on contact with the exposed pipe fitting. The resulting explosion and fire destroyed 3 homes and injured 14 people, 4 of them critically. A doorbell camera on a neighboring property captured the moment of impact and the subsequent fireball, and the 12 seconds of footage it recorded became the defining visual document of the entire event. The clip, which shows a quiet suburban street under a bright October sky suddenly filled with dozens of falling black silhouettes and then a white flash and a column of fire, was viewed over 400 million times in the 72 hours following its upload, and has since been described by media historians as one of the most watched pieces of documentary footage of the 21st century. Emergency services across the affected regions were not merely overwhelmed by the Skylog event, they were structurally paralyzed by it in ways that the incident commanders on the ground could not immediately diagnose or articulate. The problem was the air itself. In Seattle, where the drone deployment density was among the highest in the country due to the city's role as a Pacific logistics hub, the watch commander at the King County Medevac station made the decision to ground all rotary aircraft at 15:31 EST, 19 minutes into the kinetic release phase. It was not a decision he made lightly. There were already 14 confirmed impact sites within the county requiring immediate medical response, and the pressure from hospital administrators and field paramedics to get helicopters airborne was intense. But the radar picture of the low-altitude airspace over the city told a story that made the decision unambiguous. The falling and hovering drones filled the airspace below 500 feet with objects moving at unpredictable velocities and trajectories, and any rotor aircraft attempting to navigate that environment faced a collision risk that no pilot training or aircraft capability could adequately mitigate. A helicopter strike on a falling drone would not be a minor incident. A lithium battery pack of the size carried by heavy lift units impacting a helicopter rotor or engine intake at speed would be catastrophic. 2 medevac helicopters were grounded in Seattle. Across the country, the same calculation was being made at dozens of stations simultaneously, and the effect was a medical response paralysis that compounded the death toll at every impact site. Paramedics and ground vehicles faced their own version of the same problem, navigating streets where falling debris was still an active hazard and where the secondary accidents caused by the initial impacts had created gridlock that made rapid response impossible. The 142 fatalities of the first hour were not a ceiling, they were a floor. As the kinetic release phase continued and the medical response remained hobbled, the number continued to climb through the afternoon and into the evening. The system's safety protocol, the very logic that had been engineered at great expense and with genuine care to prevent mid-air collisions and protect human life, had in its failure mode effectively converted the lower atmosphere of the continental United States into an active minefield for every form of transit. The infrastructure damage of the Skylock event followed a pattern that engineers would later describe as a water hammer effect, a term borrowed from fluid dynamics to describe the destructive pressure wave that occurs when a fast-moving fluid is suddenly stopped. The drone network had been, in a meaningful sense, a fluid, a continuous flow of energy and mass through the national airspace. When that flow stopped and then reversed, the energy that had been sustaining it had to go somewhere, and it went into the grid. As units across Northern California entered the kinetic release phase and began falling from altitude, a significant percentage of them impacted the overhead high-voltage transmission lines that crisscross the state's Central Valley and coastal ranges. A falling 25-kilogram drone striking a 115 kilovolt transmission line does not simply break the line. The unit's lithium battery pack, still carrying residual charge at the moment of impact, creates a short circuit across the line's insulation that can trigger an arc flash capable of destroying the insulator hardware and initiating a ground fault. Across a span of 4 hours, 23 separate transmission line faults were recorded in the California Independent System Operator's incident log, each one requiring automatic protective relay action that took a section of the grid offline. The individual faults were manageable in isolation, but their concentration in time and geography overwhelmed the grid's automatic restoration systems, which were designed to handle sequential faults, not simultaneous ones. The result was a cascading series of brownouts and blackouts that spread across Northern California through the evening hours. Satellite imagery captured during the overnight period shows the characteristic amber glow of the Bay Area and Central Valley, interrupted by dark patches of varying sizes, neighborhoods and towns, and in 2 cases entire small cities where the power had gone out and not yet come back. The silence of the dead drones on the ground, their motors still and their navigation lights dark, was now matched in those dark patches by the silence of homes and hospitals and traffic systems that had lost power. The infrastructure that had been designed to support the drone network had become, in the network's failure, a casualty of it. Internal server logs recovered from the FAA NASG primary data center in Herndon, Virginia, and later entered into evidence at the congressional hearings, revealed a dimension of the disaster that many of the investigators found to be among its most unsettling aspects, not for any human reason, but for what it said about the nature of complex software systems. As units across the network suffered voltage collapse and fell from the sky, their telemetry beacons naturally ceased transmitting. From the perspective of the NASG coordinator, a unit that stopped transmitting was not confirmed destroyed. It was simply a unit that had gone offline, a status that the system's fault tolerance architecture was designed to handle by maintaining the unit's last known position in the airspace model and continuing to route other traffic around it. The system had been built this way deliberately to prevent a single faulty telemetry unit from creating a ghost gap in the traffic picture that other drones might be routed into. In normal operations, this was a sensible and safety-enhancing design choice. In the context of the Skylock event, it became a recursive catastrophe. As thousands of units fell and went silent, the NASG coordinator dutifully logged each one as offline, last position retained, and continued to model them as present objects in the airspace. By 1700 EST, the system was effectively hallucinating a ghost fleet of over 80,000 units, a phantom sky full of drones that no longer existed, and it was continuing to issue stay clear advisories to any remaining active units and to any aircraft attempting to enter the affected airspace based on the positions of machines that were already lying broken in suburban gutters and on highway medians hundreds of feet below. This ghost grid, as the technicians at Herndon came to call it in the hours they spent trying to understand it, prevented the official clearing of large sections of national airspace for hours after the physical sky had already emptied. Airlines holding at altitude waiting for clearance into affected airports were being told by automated systems that the airspace below them was still densely populated with drone traffic. The only solution the technical team could identify was a manual one, physically disconnecting the fiber optic backbone connections between the NASG coordinator and the regional sector servers, essentially performing a hard reset on the system's airspace model, one region at a time. Each disconnection required physical access to hardened network facilities, manual authentication procedures, and a controlled restart sequence. The full reset of all affected regional sectors took 12 hours of continuous manual labor by teams working in shifts through the night. At 12:43 EST, the final drone in the SkyGrid hoverlock, a UPS flight forward unit that had been carrying a light envelope shipment and possessed an extended range battery configuration, reached critical depletion voltage and began its terminal descent over a forested area in western Massachusetts, impacting harmlessly among trees. The acoustic signature that had dominated the soundscape of 17 metropolitan areas for nearly 3 hours ceased, replaced by what survivors described as an oppressive silence, or the sound of absence. The sky, which had been transformed into a technological ceiling of blinking lights and mechanical noise, returned to its normal empty blue, but the psychological impact of that emptiness would persist. Post-traumatic stress assessments conducted in the following months identified a syndrome researchers termed sky anxiety, a hypervigilance regarding overhead spaces, and an involuntary flinch response to the sound of small aircraft or even large insects. The physical cleanup operation recovered 71,847 intact or partially intact drones from impact sites across 7 states, with an estimated 1,200 units falling into bodies of water or remote areas where recovery was not immediately feasible. The debris field included not only the aircraft themselves, but the packages they had been carrying: consumer electronics, clothing, groceries, medical supplies, and the mundane fragments of contemporary commerce now scattered across rooftops, roadways, and yards like the artifacts of a civilization interrupted mid-transaction. The Federal Aviation Administration suspended all autonomous drone delivery operations indefinitely, pending a complete system redesign, but the technical community understood that the SkyGrid failure represented something more profound than a software bug requiring a patch. The event had revealed the fundamental vulnerability of systems that operated at scales beyond human comprehension, managed by algorithms that could fail in ways their creators had never imagined, with consequences that cascaded faster than human intervention could respond. The 142 fatalities were not the result of malice or negligence, but of a logical system executing its programming with perfect fidelity in response to a reality that did not exist, a collision that was occurring nowhere except in the mathematical models of position and threat that had been trusted to manage the sky itself.
The Skylock event ended not with a software patch or a network command or any of the decisive technical interventions that the public and the press had spent 2 days waiting for. It ended with exhaustion, the simple and absolute depletion of every energy store in every affected unit, a process that was always going to happen and that no intervention could have significantly accelerated once the lock had been established. By the morning of the second day, the sky over the continental United States was clear in a way it had not been for years, empty of the constant low-altitude traffic that had become as unremarkable a feature of American daily life as the contrails of commercial jets at altitude. The ground below, however, told the full story. The debris field stretched from suburban cul-de-sacs to interstate medians to the rooftops of downtown office buildings, a distribution map of 85,000 individual failures that, when plotted, looked almost exactly like the density map of the original deployment. The final technical report, produced by a joint FAA and NTSB investigative team after 8 months of analysis, contained a conclusion that became one of the most quoted and debated sentences in the history of engineering ethics. The drones had performed perfectly according to their safety parameters, having avoided every mid-air collision from the moment of the lock until the moment their power failed. The tragedy documented in the report's 847 pages was not, the authors were careful to specify, a failure of the machine's ability to fly. It was a failure of the system's ability to fail gracefully, a failure to design for the condition in which the safety system itself becomes the hazard, in which the protocol designed to prevent harm becomes, under conditions its designers did not model, the direct mechanism of harm. The Skylock event remains to this day the primary case study in what systems engineers call systemic rigidity, the catastrophic brittleness that can emerge in networks whose safety architectures are too inflexible to adapt when the assumptions embedded in their design turn out to be wrong. It is studied not as a story about drones or about software or even about the specific failure of a timestamp correction. It is studied as a story about the gap between a system that works and a system that is safe, and about how wide that gap can be, and about how quickly, under the right conditions, it can be crossed.